For today's episode of Let's Talk Bitcoin, we're actually going to reintroduce ourselves. Let's Talk Bitcoin is a show about the ideas, people, and projects building the digital economy and the future of money. That's kind of a fancy way of saying that we think that cryptocurrency is a fundamentally game-changing technology, and then Bitcoin is kind of at the forefront of that. My name is Adam B. Levine. I'm the editor-in-chief of Let's Talk Bitcoin, and I'm one of the hosts on the show.
I'm Stephanie Murphy. I am a radio host and a voiceover artist and a former research biochemist. I've been using Bitcoin since 2011. I'm really excited about Bitcoin because I think it helps bring human freedom to the world.
Hi, I'm Andreas Antonopoulos. I am a security expert and specialize in distributed systems. I've been working in that field for almost 2 decades now, and Bitcoin is something that has captured my imagination and has become my main passion, my main focus in my work for the last 2 years.
For the last 9 months or so, I guess it's probably closer to 10 months now, since the 25th of April, we've been doing this show twice a week, and not always with everybody on the show, but the point has been to have the high-level conversation that people who are interested in cryptocurrencies and interested in the future that's being created here, to have those conversations and to really talk about the things that might be more complicated than a new user could come to terms with easily. But for people who have been in the space for a while, these are really the important things that we need to talk about. So is Mt. Gox finally on its last legs? And is this latest problem that they've had, which resulted in the freezing of both fiat currency withdrawals and Bitcoin withdrawals, is this finally the straw that breaks the camel's back and leads to the demise of Mt. Gox?
Well, just to be clear, there was a separate problem that prevented them from processing dollar withdrawals, which they really haven't been very transparent about. But what they do say is that it's a regulatory issue or a banking problem, which is why they can't get fiat money to their customers when they try to withdraw it from the exchange. The Bitcoin withdrawal processing problem was new just this week. And actually, by all indications, they weren't too transparent about it until people started complaining very loudly. There was one guy who actually protested and flew to Mt. Gox headquarters in Tokyo and just waited for some of the higher ups at the company to come to work so he could talk to them, and posted about it on Reddit. Really funny, but it's not funny if you have Bitcoins or fiat stuck in the exchange and you can't get them out, and you're probably kind of freaking out.
I don't really think this is a different problem, though. It's the same problem. It's the same problem for the USD withdrawals. It's the same problem for the Bitcoin withdrawals. It's the same problem for the denial of service and latency problems back in April. It's the same problems before that. It's the same problems during the denial of service attack. The problem is clownish and incompetent management from the top, a sloppy development process for the software development, incompetent communication that is rare and usually self-serving and intended to shift the blame elsewhere, defensive. And again, this is the same problem. The problem is clownish and incompetent management from the top that has persisted after 3 years without any discernible improvement in the quality of people hired or the management quality to actually treat customers who have serious money in this exchange respectfully, honestly, and directly, and to admit issues when they occur, clarify what's being done to fix them quickly. And this causes these cycles where people don't trust Gox because Gox doesn't tell us what they're doing. When they do say something, it's self-serving, defensive, and aims to deflect the blame. And that creates paranoia. So customers think, oh my God, maybe the money isn't really there. Maybe that's why they're saying this. And that starts a panic and a run on the bank. And we've seen this unfold 5 times. And every single time, it's been the same basic mistakes made again and again and again. And guess what? You can fix the software, and you can fix the latency problems, and you can fix the DDoS problems, but you can't fix incompetent management. You can't until the people who are in management figure out that there's a difference between being a visionary pioneer, and all kudos and applause to them for being that, and actually running a business in a professional and consistent manner, which they're clearly unable to do. You can't fix that.
I don't necessarily disagree with you on this, and I certainly agree that Mt. Gox has had plenty of opportunities to fix this, but I also have had conversations with people who actually work with Gox or who work for Gox, and the thought there is that they're kind of trapped in an impossible situation. In the past, they've sort of said this. They've said, well, we're victims of our own success, and that's one part of it. But the other part is that they do have to interface with real world partners who a lot of times, like, for example, if they complain about their bank and the bank is the only one that'll work with them in Japan, then the bank just slows down. It actually can make the problem worse by talking about it. If you were in that same situation, Andreas, or just having difficulty scaling, what is the game plan? I mean, do you just pack up or do you just keep hiring people? Because they've done that.
Well, I think the most important thing is to be honest, direct, and prolific in the communications and consistent in the communications. I think that's been the biggest failing. It's the circling of the wagons and going quiet at a time when problems will inevitably come out. And that going quiet then leads to panic and paranoia about what the root cause is. Because in all of these cases, the main problem has been a lack of communication, or communication that is weaselly instead of being direct, and again seeks to deflect blame instead of admitting problems. Now, problems are going to happen. Of course, they're going to happen, especially in these large, rapidly scaling businesses. We're all having problems all the time. This is a very difficult, competitive, very rapidly escalating market, and it's difficult to manage a business in this environment. But it's not the problems; it's how you deal with them. And whether you deal with them in an open manner that's respectful towards your customers, and they will forgive the problems as long as you communicate clearly with them and you're direct and honest. And they will not forgive and will continuously lose trust if you repeatedly avoid communicating or communicating in a way that's more about deflecting blame than clarifying the situation. I don't blame Gox for incorrectly implementing transaction hashes. I blame Gox for a press release that then attempted to throw Bitcoin under the bus in order to pretend that somehow this wasn't their implementation problem. And
explain what that was for people who aren't caught up with that.
Well, actually, let's back up for a second here. The whole problem here is called transaction malleability, right? Let's actually take a step back and talk about that. And then I'd also like to talk about the US dollar problems they've had in the past too.
Let's talk about transaction malleability. I'll try with an analogy, I think, which works somewhat. It's obviously not 100% accurate, like no analogy is, but it may help clarify the issue. If you show up at a department store with a receipt for a pair of shoes and you want a refund, the department store is not going to trust that receipt. They're going to look at the receipt. They're going to cross-check it against their own internal records. And the reason they're going to do that is because a lot of the time people will go and buy a $20 pair of shoes and they'll come back the next day for a refund with a photoshopped receipt that shows it was a $200 pair of shoes. And if your customer service employees are not properly trained and they don't check against the records, they're going to give out $200 in refund to get a product back that you only paid $20 for. Or a customer will show up at one department store branch and get a refund, and then drive a few miles down the road and go to another branch and get another refund, and then drive a few miles down the road to another branch and get another refund, all with photoshopped or photocopied receipts. The issue here is that the receipt itself is not authoritative. The receipt can be tampered with. And it can be tampered with very creatively. You can add digits to the amount, you can photocopy it, you can make different copies for different items, you can fake the item. You could do that with delivery receipts from shipping companies. You could pretend that something that should have been delivered hasn't been delivered by creating a fake tracking request that doesn't match the internal company's tracking request. What companies in the real world do is they establish security procedures. And what they do is they try to verify the information that you present against an authoritative record. So in Bitcoin, transactions are fingerprinted with a hash. But until that transaction is confirmed into the blockchain, until it's embedded in a block and backed by proof of work computation, it's not authoritative. It's just like a paper receipt that the customer brings into a customer service department for a refund. You can't trust it. It may look like your store receipt, but someone could easily have created a duplicate. Until you can verify that against the authoritative ledger, and in Bitcoin, the authoritative ledger is the blockchain, the decentralized asset ledger backed by proof of work computation and trusted because of proof of work computation. So transaction fingerprints are authoritative only once that transaction has been confirmed. And before that, they are malleable. And the reason they're malleable is because the transaction itself is not a fixed record. It's not simply a 3-line receipt where you say from A to B amount X. That's not how Bitcoin transactions work. Within the Bitcoin transaction, you have the spending of previous outputs from a previous transaction, and then you have a scriptable language that creates an encumbrance for the next recipient. Essentially, it ties a value to a specific public key through the use of a scripting language, and that scripting language is evaluated as an equation. As long as that equation validates, that's a valid transaction and will get relayed. But there are an infinite ways you can write that equation, and there are an infinite ways you can express the previous inputs, such that each one of these variations will still be the same inputs, the same outputs, and the same amounts, but they'll be subtly different enough to create a different fingerprint. Let me give you another analogy. In the Bitcoin network, if you try to spend 2 Bitcoin, or if you try to spend 0.2 Bitcoin, or if you try to spend 0.02.00 Bitcoin, the network will evaluate all of that as 2 Bitcoin. So that's called padding. And you can do that with both positive and negative numbers. You can add zeros to the beginning or the end of the number in such a way that they won't change the way that the transaction is validated. To change the way the transaction is validated, you would have to change every single Bitcoin node to validate transactions differently. And you'd also have to make the system much less flexible. You'd have to force it into a fixed structure, which then makes it impossible to innovate. The same thing for the recipient of the transaction. That's expressed as a script, which if you've seen in the script section of blockchain info or another block explorer, you'll see it as opdupe, ophash 160, check verify, check signature. And this little script basically says, here's a public key, here's the function that you need to evaluate to confirm the person presenting this for redemption has the correct public key. But it's an equation, and you can write an equation different ways. So, think of an equation which is 4 plus 5 equals 9. The important thing is that it validates as 9, but you can write it as 4 plus 5. You can write it as 4 plus 4 plus 1. You can write it as 18 divided by 2. You can write it as the square root of 81. All of those will evaluate to 9. All of those are valid, but all of those are fundamentally different in appearance and will result in a different signature. So transaction malleability is basically the fact that we have a scripting language in a variable length encoded transaction that is flexible enough to express a very broad variety of transaction types and to be extensible. And that's critical to having a system that can allow innovation without having to change every single client every single time. Instead, you just have the rules by which things are evaluated. The problem with that means that until that transaction is essentially photocopied, stamped, and embedded into the blockchain in an immutable fashion, its fingerprint can be changed, or others can be created that are identical in every way except for the fingerprint. And this is something we've known since 2011. This is something that was published on the wiki, which ironically is owned by the Mt. Gox owner, in January of 2013. And this is something that was specifically identified as a weakness in Mt. Gox's implementation about 4 months ago. There were several posts, both by core developers and others, writing how a bot could be created to inject malleable records that would fool anyone who relied on transaction hashes in order to do withdrawal verification, and that this particular attack could be used against Mt. Gox's specific implementation to defraud them of money. They were not just warned that this was a problem, they were warned that this was a problem that their implementation was vulnerable to and that could result in them getting defrauded. And they ignored those warnings. And then when it happened, they turned around and blamed Bitcoin for not fixing transaction malleability, which can't be fixed because it's not a bug. It is an inherent characteristic of the fact that we have a variable length transaction scripting language, the core of Bitcoin. And that's not fixable. We don't want to fix that because that is how you get flexibility in the protocol. It's relying on that hash before it's confirmed that's the problem. And that's exactly what Gox was doing. And in fact, now we see that in lesser ways, in ways that had nothing to do with withdrawals, but had to do with basic accounting, several other implementations also relied on that. They weren't as vulnerable, they weren't as exploited, but they were disrupted. This went from being an edge case to a common practice and then a flood. Everyone who had bugs was affected, and all of the bugs are now getting exposed by this.
This is Chris Joseph bringing you news on Next, the first true second-generation cryptocurrency for February 18th, 2014. More and more software clients are appearing for Next. Aside from the basic NRS client that is installed with the server, we now have a new open-source web-based client, a native Mac client, .next and Next Solaris for Windows, and two cross-platform clients called Client Next and Offspring. Several of these clients also support the decentralized exchange, which is still being tested on a testnet. All of these clients were created by members of the Next community, and you can find all of them at nextclient.org. That's nxtclient.org. For more information, head to nextcrypto.org or mynxt.org. And stay tuned for more news on Next in the next Let's Talk Bitcoin broadcast.